So I want to be absolutely candid about this. I don't know Stephen A. Smith at all personally. I interviewed him maybe once or twice years ago when I was working for The Root. Stephen A. Smith is a quintessential example of the difference between being influential and being known, right? Stephen A. Smith is a very well-known person. When he speaks, people pay attention. He has no real influence. I want to make that clear. He has no real influence in politics. He desperately wants to have influence in politics. He desperately wants to be considered amongst the same spaces as a Roland Martin or a Bakari Sellers or an Angela Rye or a Tiffany Cross or Abby Phillips. He wants to be in that category. He wants to think that he can actually move the needle, and he is being platformed, unfortunately, by a lot of less than informed journalists who are bored and looking for someone who's making loud noises. But let us be clear about who and what he is at this particular point, which is just a loudmouth person who is desperate to be put into different spaces. That's the first thing, right? That's not an insult. Hey, if he hears this, fine, he can. I don't really care. He doesn't have any influence on my life. There's not a politician alive in America who's making their decisions based on what Stephen A. Smith says. Even if Eric Swalwell decides to bring him to Washington, D.C., I've met Eric Swalwell. I'm a fan of his. Eric, don't waste your time, because Stephen A. Smith doesn't represent anybody other than himself and the small number of Republicans and Republican acolytes who are friends of his. And that's the second thing I want to point out. This man is best friends with Chris Christie. He is a Republican. Stephen A. Smith is a Republican. Look at the pictures of him and that crazy human rights abusing police chief, right? Look at all the opportunities that he always takes to attack the Democratic Party. And the issue that I have with him, besides the fact that he's not informed on any of these issues whatsoever, before I even go back to the mistakes he's made in journalism, before I go back to his well-documented history of inappropriate, tacky, and crass comments about women, in particular black women, before I even get into any of that, I will highlight the fact that Stephen A. Smith is a Republican, and he is too much of a coward, and I will say coward, intellectually and personally, to just admit that on the air. Because the moment that he says he's a Republican, then he can no longer play the game he's playing now, which is, oh, I'm just a Democrat who's disappointed, and now people will pay attention to me. Just come out.
That reminds me
just
of
come
something.
out, Stephen A. Smith, and say you're a Republican.
That reminds me of
It's the
something.
grift. It's the grift. It's your book.
This reminds me.
And I don't want to make this clear, because as all the people who are talking about Stephen A. Smith running for president, that guy's not going to run for president, right? And the best way to handle this kind of grift, the best way to handle this kind of disingenuous nonsense is to ignore him. So what that he goes on Bill Maher? Bill Maher has lost credibility with the vast majority of substantive journalists in this America 8 years ago. Right? He is a right winger who's angry because his old comedy routines from the 90s making fun of Muslims don't go over so well at Berkeley anymore. Get some new material. Okay? Stephen A. Smith is trying to slowly navigate himself into legitimate spaces in journalism so that he can appear to be credible, so that he can use that to sort of leverage himself against ESPN, which is a dying network like a lot of other things on cable are dying. Listen to him at your peril, Democratic Party, because this man knows nothing. He represents nothing. He is not in contact with a certain segment of the African American population, and he is making bad faith assessments of the Democratic Party because he is not a Democrat. And I'm not saying that as somebody who is a Democratic fan. I'm saying that as somebody who actually cares about this country and not my own personal self-aggrandizement. And I also say this as somebody who actually understands politics.
Yeah, you're very critical of Democrats. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I don't have any loyalty to Democrats or Republicans. You know, I have none whatsoever. I feel the same way. Yeah, these kinds of voices, the way they get platformed, it's just. But it's an old school formula. I just think it's ridiculous. And I mean, if you feel that way, leave Joanne Reid out of it.
Well, but you know what, the deeper thing though, and this is where I have the problem. It's him, it's Marcellus Wiley, it's Jason Whitlock, it's the whole crew of them. All of these people, remember in the late 80s, early 90s when you suddenly had, all of these actors who wanted to sing, right? And And I say this as somebody there, when you become prominent and successful in one space, you often have a desire to move into another, right? Rush Limbaugh had already conquered talk radio, but he really wanted to get into sports, right? Rush Limbaugh getting that job on Monday Night Football was his dream come true. Here's the difference, though, and people can find this insulting, but it's actually true. Sports is entertainment. So my opinion is just as valid as yours as long as I look at the stats. But politics affects real people's lives. It's policy. It's the health, future, and protection of this country. So if I'm an opinionated person in politics, like I am a professional legal analyst, I'm a professional political analyst, I'm a host, I have a PhD in political science. The fact that I have sports opinions is fine because it's entertainment. But just because you've conquered sports doesn't mean you know a damn thing about how this country works, how this country can be saved, and what this country needs to do. And people need to understand that being successful in one area doesn't mean you can ice skate in another.